This is Debt Weapon. The most private room in your house is hiding a 30-year secret. You might not realize it, but the everyday household appliance you use without a second thought is actually the product of a massive, heavily regulated battleground. In this explainer, we're going to pull back the curtain on how a sweeping federal mandate turned basic engineering into a dark theater of corporate fraud and bureaucratic overreach. So why exactly is the government inside your bathroom? Well, to the bureaucrats in Washington, controlling your daily habits from the top down was pitched as a massive, sweeping victory for the environment. But if you actually lived through the 1990s, you know the truth. It triggered a catastrophic, deeply frustrating era. We're talking about endless clogs, hilariously weak flushes, and an absolute golden age for the plunger industry. Let's trace how this entire disaster was engineered. It all started back in 1992 when President George H.W. Bush signed the Energy Policy Act. Overnight, a multi-billion-dollar industry was thrown into absolute chaos. Manufacturers were given a razor-thin window, just 2 years, to completely abandon the reliable, water-guzzling 7-gallon beasts that Americans relied on and comply with a radical, untested federal limit. That strict new limit? Just 1.6 gallons. Out of nowhere, the government arbitrarily decided that eliminating solid waste, what industry insiders delicately refer to as precious gems, required no more than 1.6 gallons of water. This single, rigid metric threw massive corporations into a total panic. They simply didn't know how to obey the new law without fundamentally breaking their own products. Now, how do massive, entrenched corporations usually react to sudden, crushing government mandates? They cut corners. Instead of investing in real innovation, giants like Kohler took the path of least resistance. They literally just shrank the water tanks. They restricted the bottom holes to artificially force pressure, completely ignoring the actual physics required to make it work. The result? A weak, gravity-assisted crackle that couldn't move anything larger than a pebble. The system was broken by design. And the design failure was so spectacularly bad that everyday American citizens openly revolted. Out of sheer desperation, people were literally crossing the border into Canada to smuggle in high-flow toilets. Think about that. Everyday people scouring yard sales for functioning older models, hauling them back home like illegal contraband. A literal black market for plumbing was born out of pure bureaucratic incompetence. You have to ask yourself, how did these utterly useless, failing appliances legally make it onto the open market in the first place? Well, behind closed doors, there was a deeply flawed, institutionalized certification standard. It was a massive loophole. We call it the plastic ball fraud. The deception was hiding in plain sight. Institutional testing for these mandates was nothing more than a simple pass-or-fail charade. A product was legally deemed compliant if it managed to flush paper sponges and little plastic balls. That was it. Passing a test by flushing synthetic, perfectly uniform sponges versus flushing actual unpredictable solid waste. It was a metric that gave the American consumer absolutely zero idea of real-world performance. But it actually gets worse. The threshold for success in these tests was incredibly low. If a unit could swallow just 79% of those little synthetic sponges, the government rubber-stamped it with their official seal of approval. They were actively hiding a fundamentally failing product behind an illusion of environmental progress. Consumers were kept completely in the dark, and the corporate giants were just playing along with the game. But here's the thing about broken systems. They always, eventually, face a reckoning. To shatter this collective fraud and save the failing infrastructure, two visionary engineers stepped up, Bill Goley and John Kohler. They looked at the data and initiated what we can only describe as a rogue scientific rebellion. They knew the federal metrics were a total joke, and they set out to prove it to the world. Their weapon of choice was the Maximum Performance or MAP test. They completely threw out the government's plastic balls and paper sponges. Instead, they brought in 50-gram tubes of extruded soybean paste. Why soybean paste? Because its density and texture brutally and accurately mirror human waste. They brought terrifying, undeniable realism right back into the laboratory. To do this right, they needed a baseline. Digging into a 1977 medical study, they found that the largest single specimen produced by a healthy adult male weighed exactly 250 grams. By locking in this specific number, they finally established a scientifically rigorous, undeniable benchmark. They were locked, loaded, and ready to expose the federal racket. What happened next was an absolute bloodbath for the industry. When Gawley and Collar subjected 44 strictly government-approved models to their relentless 250-gram soybean challenge, nearly half of them failed entirely. Out of 44 legally compliant units, only 24 could actually pass a real-world test. It was undeniable, hard proof that the federal metrics were a complete fabrication. The emperor truly had no clothes. The exposure was swift, and it was humiliating. Suddenly, the hard data was public. Forced into a corner by this raw scientific truth, the corporate monopolies had no choice left. They could no longer hide behind fake plastic balls. They had to legitimately engineer their way out of a disaster the government had created. They were forced to build an empire of actual, undeniable efficiency. And that's when real innovation finally took over. Manufacturers like Toto completely abandoned the standard, gravity-fed drop that had been used for decades. They pioneered radical new hydro innovations, like the Drake model. They engineered diagonal streams of highly pressurized water that violently cleaned the bowl, all while using even less water than that draconian 1.6-gallon limit. It was an engineering marvel, forged directly in the fires of strict regulation. The resulting numbers? Absolutely staggering. Under the intense, unyielding pressure of realistic testing, the industry's average performance didn't just slowly improve, it skyrocketed. Before this wave of innovation, the average unit struggled to move just 336 grams of waste. By 2017, the average model was effortlessly destroying 882 grams. They had built machines infinitely more powerful than those old water-wasting monsters of the past. Which brings us to the ultimate payoff. $260 billion. If the entire nation switched over to these aggressively engineered high-efficiency models, it would save an estimated 260 billion gallons of water every single year. To put that massive number into perspective, that is enough water to give a private Olympic swimming pool to every single resident of Cleveland. Yet, the geopolitical reality of regulation is often a trap. In 2019, there was a major political push to roll back this exact mandate, with critics claiming people were still forced to flush 10 to 15 times. But surprisingly, the industry stood firm against the rollback. Plumbers and corporate manufacturers actually disagreed with the politicians. Why? Because they intimately understood that the 1992 law operates as a permanent one-way street. In the modern bureaucratic machine, regulations only ever grow stronger. They never give power back. This leaves us with a fascinating, almost bitter irony. The government often treats its citizens like docile cogs in a broken machine, demanding blind obedience. But despite attempting to micromanage behavior from the top down, the crushing weight of that regulation inadvertently forced brilliant, unstoppable innovation. It took 30 years of flushing extruded soybean paste, but the sheer friction of the system produced a masterclass in modern engineering. Which brings us to a final, deeply unsettling question. When the government locks the doors to innovation, what other fraudulent metrics are quietly ruling your life right now? The low-flow toilet scam is just one small piece of a much larger puzzle. Model the thinking that works. Reject the bureaucratic pillars that hold up broken systems. Stay dangerous. Always question the data. And join us next time on This Explainer as we continue to uncover the hidden systems controlling your world.